Hello and welcome back to Hummingbird Paper Crafts. Today I am going to be showing you how to make a sunflower card using both a stamp and embossing technique and stenciling. This is the stamp I'm going to be using. It's a Maker Forte Sunflower Zentangle stamp. I'm also going to be using clear embossing ink and some clear embossing powder. So to start I need to ink up this stamp. It's quite a detailed stamp, which these rubber backed ones are, but they're fabulous for doing backgrounds, especially if you're doing it with just a watermark effect, which the embossing will do. So I'm making sure I'm getting into all the tiny little bits of the stamp. I don't want any of it to be left uninked. Making sure every section of it is covered and that there is plenty of that ink on there. I'm then going to leave the stamp lid flat on my desk and I'm going to place my paper over the top of it. This piece of paper is cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I will cut it down slightly a bit later on. Using my Maker Forte spreader to make sure that that ink is transferred to every section of the card. Just going over it again and again. Don't need a lot of pressure, you just need to make sure that the paper doesn't move and that the ink covers it. You might just be able to pick it up there. It's very difficult on camera. So now I'm going to sprinkle clear embossing powder across it. Yes, I buy clear embossing powder in big tubs and decant them into this box because it's much easier to work with. Covering all of the inked section, you can just about make it out on there. You just turn it around so I get both sides. And like I said, this will only give a very light effect to the background, but you'll see it come to life when I stencil over the top of it. So I think I've managed to catch everything there. I didn't use an embossing buddy before I inked this because the whole of the card's covered. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit extra where it shouldn't be. I start with my heat gun, holding it down with some tweezers, and then I realise I need to have something underneath this or else it's going to melt my mat. The Make Art boards are great for this, the metal boards. I use them for this, I use them for stenciling. So I've got my heat gun heated up here. It is normally better to preheat your heat gun. That way, as soon as you bring it to your paper, it starts to melt the powder. I didn't in this instance, so I have to wait a little bit till it gets going. But once it gets going, it's fairly quick to melt it all and gives a great shine, a subtle shine, should I say. So there, it's melting up that side. Just shaking it a bit just to make sure that I'm getting all the tiny little leaves and detail that's on this stamp. It's actually a Zentangle stamp and looks great stamped in black ink. But I want to bring out the detail with stenciling, so you'll see shortly how I do that. So I think I might have got it all there. No, I'm just going to have to turn it round to get the bottom edge. You see my heat tool has got look like little antennae, the legs that it stands on to cool it down afterwards. So just making sure I've got all the edges there. And there we have it. So you can just about make out the shine on that with the sunflowers and leaves that's in the pattern on that stamp. Now on to stenciling. I'm just going to fasten my paper down so that it doesn't move about. Just using a bit of post-it tape for that. Stencil, like I say, the stencil is called Layered Sunflower and it's in 4 sections. So I start with the first layer, which is a solid part of the flower, and I'm using California Love ink for this. This is a very vibrant yellow ink. Say one of the neon ones, but once I add the rest of the flower in, it will tone it down. So I'm just using a blending brush. I'm just going lightly over it to start with, making sure that I cover everything. I'm doing the petals of the flower first, so that I know that I've got all of them done before I fill in the centre. The centre's actually going to have more detail in there from the rest of the stencil, but I'm covering it all with the yellow to start with. Over and over. I think I've got enough on there. Just blending it out into the middle. Now I'm going to move across to the petaled layer. As you can see, I stuck my paper down with post-it tape because I didn't want it to move when I lifted the stencil up. Just makes it easier for lining up, because if you move the stencil up to the leaf, to the petal section, it's in the same direction as it was for the main section. With this, I'm just going to, this is actually Red Leicester ink colour, and I'm just going to go in the middle really, just to give a tinge to the inner petals. Making sure I go out far enough to catch the little petals that are in the back of it. And I'm just going to come back in with my yellow blending brush just to blend that orange into the yellow. Give us a pretty sunflower. So the next section is the middle. I'm sorry if you can hear some noises. We've just had 5 puppies and they're squeaking in their bed. So lined up the circle with the centre of the flower. And I'm going to use brush corduroy distress ink for my centres. Only a light covering, but this will really make the embossing underneath the stenciling pop. So I tap some off my brush because, like I say, I only want a light covering of this. I don't want it to go too dark. And there you can just make out the flower underneath coming out, making the emboss resist where the powder is. So that's that layer, and there's one final layer which is the dotty layer, and for this one I'm using ground espresso distress ink. Just holding my stencil down there. So go over with this. It's quite a deep brown ink is this, but the stencil's only dots, so it doesn't cover up too much, and that's all that's needed for that. And that's the stenciling finished. Let's move all my things out of the way and then take off the stencil. These stencils are great, you can just rinse them off with water, but there you can see the resist of the embossing powder underneath the flower. So I'm going to trim this down to 4 by 5 1/4, taking a little bit off each side and then a bit off the bottom. This is just because I want to put a mat underneath the actual image when I build up my card. So taking it down just 1/8 of an inch on that side, turn it round and I take 1/8 of an inch off the other side, which takes it down to 4 inches. I like a very fine edge for my mats. I don't like to have a deep layer from underneath, so I do tend to just do 1/8 of an inch on each side. Now this part I cut some simple sayings from the Spring Has Sprung section, and I'm going to foil them, use the dies to cut them, and then I've just used some gold foil which just covers the letters. Ran it through my laminator, which kind of melts the foil onto the ink. There's lots and lots of different sentiments in each sheet of these. I found that it didn't stand too well off the card, so what I'm doing is I'm going back with the die that I used to cut all the simple sayings. It's the Simply Stated die. So here I'm cutting my mat at this orange card first, and I'm going to cut a strip for the die as well. So that's my mat, that's my card base, and like I said, I go back with this die. I just want one strip, so I'm just putting a small offcut of the orange card across them, and I'm going to offset this on my sentiment. So there you go, that's how I'm doing. Now I missed part of my video unfortunately, so here I've built my card up, I've put my mat and my image with wet glue onto my card base. I've offset the sentiment and put that with foam tape. Just to finish the card, I'm going to go in with some crown jewels in lemon to go with the yellow of the card. And for this, I'm going to be using the crystal clear Maker's Magic, which I put in one of the Maker's Magic rings. These are great for holding tiny bits of glue and the like. You can even put some of your gems in if you're needing to hold a few. So I'm just putting 3 down there. I do consider putting some actually on the flower, but change my mind. So then I am going to grab a microbrush applicator. These little pink brushes are great for using with tiny bits of ink. It's a very fine brush on the end, so dip it into my glue, lift up my gem, put a little bit of glue down, and there you go. Again, a bit more glue, dot it onto the card, and one final little bit for the one that I've put underneath my sentiment. As I was saying, my sentiment I've staggered with the orange card just so that it stands out a little bit more from the card. And there you go, that's the card finished. These rings are great because you can use them over and over and over again. All you have to do is let the glue dry in there, pick it out with your pokey tool, and it's good to go again. Same with the brushes. You can actually use them again. The tip will go hard with the glue, but for doing tiny bits of glue like gluing on gems, it doesn't really matter. And there we have it. I'll just show you that you can see that embossed detail on there. The sentiment says, "Where flowers bloom, so does hope."